June 2019. In Charleston, South Carolina, the air was filled with the sense of a scorching summer, interwoven with the fragrance of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. The weather was not too hot, but the humidity was present in every breath. The city looked as if it had been carved out of a book about the southern states of the U.S., with its historic buildings, cobblestone streets, and lush green trees that seemed to embrace the city itself, shielding its luxury and sophistication from the outside world. Every corner was so perfect that it was hard to believe this place actually existed. For Daniel Harris, who had just arrived, this city seemed surreal. He was a 30-year-old African-American who had come from Nigeria, and every step he took was filled with both excitement and skepticism. Daniel was a tall, lean man with a confident gaze, but his eyes reflected a mix of emotions, anxiety, and hope. He knew all too well that life in Nigeria had been full of struggles and hardships. Everything he knew about America was merely fragments of dreams he had long nurtured in his homeland. But now, standing here in Charleston, on this new and unfamiliar path, his perspective on the world was shifting with each step. He stood at the gate of Lauren's house, his wife's home, and listened to the silence for a moment. The white, two-story house with its large windows, spacious garden, and neatly trimmed lawns spoke of a kind of luxury he had never known. Lauren greeted him with the warm smile she always wore and invited him inside. Inside, the house was peaceful and cozy. Daniel stood in the hallway looking up at the high ceilings, the beautiful paintings on the walls, the expensive furniture, and his mind struggled to process the fact that this house was now part of his life. Everything was so beautiful, so flawless, that he couldn't immediately believe he was truly part of this world. Everything was in perfect order, from the polished marble floors to the perfectly arranged curtains on the windows. Lauren had lived in this world her entire life, and she was trying to make it his world as well. Daniel tried not to let his accent make him stand out, not to attract unnecessary attention, but the feeling of discomfort never left him. This house, and Lauren's entire life, felt so distant from what he had known in Nigeria. Life in Lagos had been different. There, chaos was an everyday reality, and each day was a struggle for survival. Streets were filled with people trying to sell whatever they could. Noise, dust, traffic, and poverty. That was his childhood and youth. He had grown up in that environment, and it had taught him to appreciate hard work, but it also made him understand how difficult it was to earn even the smallest things in life. But here, in Charleston, everything was different. Daniel was surrounded by comfort, luxury, and peace. He realized he had become part of another world, and that both excited and unsettled him. He was grateful to Lauren for bringing him here, but his unease remained. They spent time together, enjoying the quiet and serenity. Lauren took him around Charleston, showing him the city's best places, the historic districts, the beautiful waterfronts, the grand mansions, and parks with perfectly trimmed trees. Daniel was walking through such parks for the first time in his life, and his eyes sparkled with wonder. In the evenings, they dined at expensive restaurants. Lauren chose exquisite dishes, and Daniel couldn't even pronounce their names. They were so different from what he was used to eating in Nigeria. Sometimes they drank wine, but he only raised his glass slightly, trying not to stand out because, honestly, he wasn't familiar with the taste of wine. He felt like an outsider among these people, high class, refined, and confident. These dinners were magnificent, yet foreign to him, and his thoughts often drifted back to the life he had left behind. He still didn't know exactly how to start his new life, how to become not just Lauren's husband, but a full-fledged member of society. For now, he felt like a guest, not a rightful citizen of this country. His life depended on Lauren, and that fact weighed on him. He began thinking about citizenship. In Nigeria, he had been independent, and now, in America, he needed that status again. He started researching citizenship through every possible channel, online, through conversations with colleagues and acquaintances, asking about ways to speed up the process. Soon, he learned that through marriage, the naturalization process takes several years. To him, that was too long. He wanted to make it happen faster. The thought never left his mind. One day, when Lauren was out on business, Daniel decided it was time to act. He sat down with his laptop and began searching for ways to accelerate the citizenship process. He found several options that could speed things up, and that was when his decision became final. He would go to the immigration office to find out all the details. He had no idea that this step would lead to consequences that would change his life forever. With every step, with every breath, he felt more and more trapped. The internal conflict between being part of a foreign world and wanting to become independent only grew stronger. That day, he made a decision that would shape his future. He was ready to find a way and solve any problem that arose. He knew that a difficult path lay ahead, and though he had already made his choice, he couldn't have known that this step would not only mark the beginning of a new life, but also the end of his old one. Daniel Harris spent several days reflecting on his meeting with the immigration officials. His anxiety and uncertainty continued to torment him. Outwardly, he tried to remain calm, but inside, doubts and fears churned within him. He couldn't look at his life in the U.S. with peace of mind, feeling dependent on Lauren. All he needed was citizenship to get on his feet, to become a full-fledged member of this country. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that for this he would have to fight not only with the laws but also with himself. The process of obtaining citizenship through marriage promised to be long, but he was determined to do everything in his power to accelerate the process. Daniel knew that Lauren would help him with this, but it was important for him to achieve his goal on his own. He couldn't allow himself to remain in the shadow of his wife. His goal was clear: to fast-track every step, to gain the legal right to live here, work, and build his life, without being just the husband of a U.S. citizen. He wanted to be independent. The next morning, after several days of reflection, he decided to act. Lauren had gone to a meeting with her colleagues, and Daniel saw an opportunity to visit the local immigration office. He knew that this step could be a turning point in his life, but he felt that this was the moment to act. The path to his goal lay through formalities and bureaucracy, but he was ready for it. He arrived at the office where the Immigration Service was located. It was a modern building with shiny glass windows, beautiful landscaping, and perfectly paved walkways. To him, this place was as new and foreign as all of America, but now it had become an essential part of his journey. Inside, it was quiet, and the air felt fresh and new. People in the office, most of them immigrants, were sitting and waiting their turn. Daniel approached the counter, where a young woman with bright eyes and a light smile was seated. She immediately noticed him, standing out from the other visitors. She was calm, confident, and her gaze conveyed professionalism. He explained that he had come to inquire about ways to speed up the citizenship process. The woman explained the standard procedure, the steps he would need to go through, and how long each stage might take. Daniel didn't like her answer. He felt the information was too general, and that she was hiding something important from him. He needed more. He continued listening as she briefly mentioned the possibility of speeding up the process through certain connections and influences. That caught his attention. Daniel immediately felt that this conversation could be pivotal, that he should use this information. He realized that perhaps only such paths could lead him to his goal. He didn't want to wait for years. He wanted to act now, to gain independence as quickly as possible. After getting the necessary answers and doing some thinking, Daniel left the office. His head was full of plans and new ideas. Inside him, confidence was building, that everything was possible. He knew he couldn't stop there. He had to find ways to accelerate the citizenship process, and now he had new directions to act. He understood that difficulties lay ahead, but this was just the first step toward achieving his goal. That same day, he returned home. Lauren greeted him with a smile, having prepared dinner. They sat at the table, but Daniel was no longer the man who easily shared his thoughts. A battle was raging inside him. He felt more and more that he couldn't tell Lauren everything that had happened at the immigration office. His intentions were becoming clearer, but they were also starting to cross a line that Lauren might not approve of. He wasn't ready to discuss his ambitions and plans with her. Daniel began to realize that now he was at a crossroads. His decision to take action meant he was stepping into a more complicated game. He had to decide how to move forward and who to align himself with to reach his goal. He saw many possible paths ahead, but he knew that each of them could lead to unpredictable consequences. There was no turning back. As the evening came and Lauren rested, he again submerged himself in his thoughts. He knew that his next meeting with the young woman at the immigration office would be an important step in his life. She could be the key that would open the doors to his citizenship. But at the same time, he realized that with each step he would take, he would become more entangled in the web of his own ambitions and desires. This was just the beginning. After several days of reflection and planning, Daniel felt that his life in Charleston, becoming more predictable with each passing day, was pulling him in too much. Lauren had been his support. She cared for him, created comfort, but it was not the kind of comfort he was looking for. Inside him, the need for independence still smoldered, the need to prove to himself that he was capable of more than just depending on his wife. He was ready for the fight, and despite all the love between them, his desire to act had become stronger. Daniel continued to work on himself, perfecting his English, looking for ways to establish himself in the country. He found that obtaining citizenship through marriage was a long and difficult process that could take several years. This thought tormented him, and despite the advice of other immigrants, he didn't want to rely on the slow process that would only grant him citizenship after several years. He felt something had to change, and perhaps something needed to change too quickly. When he found himself in the immigration office again, he was greeted by Brooke, the same employee he had met during his first visit. Daniel couldn't help but notice her calm demeanor, confidence, and especially the strange interest with which she looked at him when their eyes met. There was something more in her gaze than just professional politeness. In her presence, despite his resolve, his inner state became increasingly tense. Daniel began to feel that something was building between them. Their meeting, although starting as a routine paperwork session, gradually became something more. With each subsequent conversation, Daniel felt that their communication was evolving into something more personal. With every new message from Brooke, it became clear that she was starting to see him not only as a client, but as a person she could talk to beyond the official matters. And although Daniel still didn't realize what was happening, he felt something was changing. He continued to listen to himself, not knowing that his desire for citizenship could lead to unexpected consequences. As strange as it was, there was something irresistibly alluring in this process. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he had found himself in a situation where his desires, motivations, and goals seemed to be intertwined in some complex pattern. He understood that everything wasn't happening just by chance, that every step he took was pulling him deeper into this relationship. Soon, their communication began to include personal messages. It was something more than just professional exchange. Each day they shared thoughts and details of their lives. Brooke began to open up about her struggles, her work, and her past. She was open and trusted him. While in the U.S., Daniel never thought he would form such a relationship with a woman who could one day play such a crucial role in his life. But at some point, he felt that he was becoming more dependent on their communication. At the same time, Daniel felt that his wife, Lauren, was starting to suspect something. She began to pay him more attention, noticing that his late-night walks or long meetings were becoming more frequent, and that there was something different in his behavior. He was starting to distance himself. He tried to justify his actions, hiding the truth from her, but she was becoming more and more wary. She wouldn't be Lauren if she hadn't noticed that her husband was acting differently. She began to search for answers to the questions that Daniel was trying to avoid. As time went on, each new message from Brooke became increasingly tense and significant. Now, between them, there was not just interest, but a secret that threatened not only his relationship with his wife, but the future he was striving for. He couldn't understand why he had become so captivated by this woman, as he was married and had a life he was accustomed to. He continued to hide his feelings, but something was changing inside him. Brooke was the woman who could become his key to citizenship, and in her eyes he began to see not just a helper, but a partner who could help him with this. Soon their meetings became more frequent, and late-night walks through Charleston's restaurants and cafes became not just a way to escape daily concerns. They discussed not only documents and bureaucracy but also personal lives, their experiences and desires. These meetings became something new and exciting for Daniel. He became more and more immersed in this new world that was unfolding before him. From time to time, they spent evenings together, and Daniel felt the tension growing. He realized that his desire for citizenship was becoming more closely tied to his secret attraction to Brooke. At this moment, his life began to take an unexpected turn. He increasingly felt like he was trapped by his own ambitions and growing feelings. He didn't know how this would end, but he understood that his actions could lead to consequences he couldn't predict. And although he longed for independence, he was no longer sure he wanted to be completely free from everything that connected him to this new world. With each passing day, Daniel felt more and more as if his life in America was slipping out of control. He realized that this couldn't go on forever. Outwardly, his relationship with Lauren remained warm, and she continued to try and create comfort for him. But in reality, Daniel couldn't help but notice that Lauren had become much more wary. New notes of concern had appeared in her gaze, and her behavior was becoming increasingly strange. She didn't ask direct questions, but his inner sense told him that she understood everything. Meanwhile, his relationship with Brooke had become much more complicated. While Daniel continued meeting with her, his feelings for her grew stronger, and despite trying to keep his emotions under control, it was impossible not to notice that Brooke was paying him attention. She began calling him not just by his name, but also adding affectionate nicknames that stirred his inner turmoil. This became especially dangerous for him, as he was married, and Lauren remained his lawful wife. Time passed, and their meetings became more intimate. Daniel felt that he was finding in Brooke not only support for his citizenship matters, but also a personal attachment he couldn't explain. Brooke wasn't just a woman helping with administrative issues. She had become his salvation, his key to a new world. This world attracted him, but at the same time, it scared him. He understood that his actions were becoming riskier, and the consequences could be catastrophic. When Lauren began to suspect that something was wrong, she didn't react aggressively. Instead, she withdrew into herself, becoming more distant and silent. She didn't voice her suspicions, but she stayed home more often, watching Daniel closely. She sought explanations for his behavior but couldn't figure out what was happening in his life. His constant delays, secret meetings, strange phone calls, these things made her doubt, and although she couldn't directly accuse him of cheating, she began to feel that she was losing him. At that moment, when her suspicions peaked, Lauren made a decision. She understood that she needed to do something to uncover the truth. She knew her husband was cheating on her, and although she didn't know all the details yet, her intuition told her that Brooke was the one with whom Daniel had started this risky affair. All she could do now was quietly follow him and gather evidence. She began checking his things, looking for clues, and soon she found what she had been looking for. On one of the evenings when Daniel went out to dinner with Brooke, Lauren decided to take matters into her own hands. She purchased a small bug that she could hide in his clothes, and that night while he was sleeping, she carefully slipped it into the pocket of his jacket. It was dangerous, but she could no longer afford to remain ignorant. Lauren began tracking his movements on her phone, knowing that she would now be able to know where he was at any moment. Time would show that her intuition was correct. She kept an eye on his dates, his conversations with Brooke, and with each passing day, her certainty grew that he had betrayed her. Lauren could no longer suppress her emotions. She felt her heart tighten with pain. She decided to get revenge, but first she needed to hurt him so that he would understand that he couldn't treat her like this. She began planning her revenge. Lauren didn't allow herself to appear too emotional. Everything was calculated. She knew that, first and foremost, she needed to cause him emotional pain, to make him feel what it was like to be deceived and betrayed. To start, she decided to act through Brooke. Lauren went to her house, finding out where she lived. She decided to speak with her, not expecting things to become so painful. Lauren told Brooke the entire truth about her affair with Daniel, about how he was using her not for love, but for personal gain. She made it clear to Brooke that she wasn't the only one who had been deceived. When Lauren left Brooke's house, she felt her anger reach its peak. Everything she had done was not just revenge, it was her way of regaining control of the situation. She knew Daniel deserved to be punished for what he had done, and that his betrayal shouldn't go unpunished. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his secret life, unaware that his world was about to collapse. He kept meeting with Brooke, hoping that his ambitions and desires would lead him to citizenship, to independence, and full control over his life in this country. But everything he had built was falling apart the moment Lauren discovered the truth and began to act. Several days passed, but for Daniel, time dragged on painfully. He didn't know that his life was about to change. He continued his meetings with Brooke, trying to deepen their relationship and secure his position. He was sure that his goal, citizenship, was within reach, and that gave him the strength to continue his hidden game. But everything he had been building was already starting to fall apart, and he didn't realize it. Lauren kept watching him. Her heart was filled with pain, anger, and disappointment. She knew her husband had betrayed her, and this feeling had sunk deep into her soul. She tried to find a way out, but at some point she decided that the only way to regain control was to make him feel the same pain she was experiencing. She decided she would take revenge on him. The revenge had to be torturous. It had to make him regret his betrayal. Lauren did not hide her dissatisfaction. She felt that her life no longer had meaning if Daniel continued to deceive her. She was completely consumed by the plan for revenge, and her thoughts were becoming darker and more sinister. Lauren could no longer bear it. Her anger poured out into something cruel, something she could no longer control. Meanwhile, Daniel, unaware of his wife's plans, was consumed by his secret life. He knew that Brooke was his chance, his opportunity to get citizenship faster. He already imagined how his status in this country would change, how he would gain independence, how his life would become stable and successful. But there was no room for other thoughts in his mind, and he was blind to what was happening around him. That night, when everything was about to change, Lauren was preparing for the decisive step. She knew she had to act. Waiting for the right moment could not go on forever. The time had come. Lauren decided to act when Daniel came home late after another meeting with Brooke. He was tired, but there was joy in his eyes because he felt everything was going according to plan. He entered the house, unaware that Lauren was waiting for him. She was calm, but her calmness hid a determination that had been growing within her every day. She had done everything to prepare for this moment. He took a shower, unaware that she was watching his every move. She stood in the kitchen, listening to the sounds from the bathroom. In her hands was a knife. Not an ordinary knife, a kitchen knife she had used to prepare dinner. But tonight, this knife was not for chopping vegetables. In the moment when Daniel came out of the bathroom and headed for the bed, Lauren took her first step. She slipped sleeping pills into his glass of water, and Daniel, unsuspecting, drank it. Lauren watched as he gradually lost consciousness. Her heart raced, but she could not stop. She understood that now was the time to act. The revenge she had been planning for so long was close to coming to fruition. She crept up to the bed, and, as often happens in the darkest and most turbulent moments, her mind, filled with fury, made her do something she would later regret. With each step, Lauren felt her action becoming inevitable. She could not stop when the knife was in her hand. She had long realized that her life would never be the same if she didn't take this step. Each strike felt like liberation. Each new wound on Daniel's body was her way of regaining control. She understood that she could no longer endure. She was ready to finish it once and for all. When everything was done, and Daniel lay on the bed, Lauren stopped, her breath shallow. In that moment, her mind returned to reality. She stood in the dark room, not knowing what to do next. Everything that had happened was unbelievable. She realized she had done something she never could have imagined just a few days ago. But now, it was too late. He was dead. The storm of feelings in her soul mingled with horror. She stood before her husband's lifeless body, realizing that this decision would forever change her life. She was confused. Deep down, she knew she had made a mistake, but it was too late to turn back. Lauren didn't know what to do, but she understood that her only option was to confess her crime. This was her last attempt to find some relief, even if only temporary. With trembling hands, she dialed the police and told them that she had killed her husband. The words didn't come easily, but she knew she could no longer hide the truth. When the police arrived, Lauren was ready for anything. She confessed to the murder, standing before them with an empty gaze and her head lowered. Her life no longer had meaning, and she knew a long path awaited her, one that would end in the dark corridors of prison. After Lauren called the police, her life took an irreversible turn. Every moment waiting for their arrival felt endless. She sat on the chair next to Daniel's body, staring at him and feeling a heavy emptiness settle in her chest. She still couldn't believe she had done it. In her mind, there were no clear thoughts. Everything was mixed: confusion, fear, anger, but at the same time there was a strange sense of relief. She knew her actions were catastrophic, but perhaps this catastrophe was exactly what she had been searching for: freedom from the pain and humiliation she had endured. She realized that her life with Daniel was over, and her actions could not be justified. But at the same time, she felt that all her struggles, her suffering, her fight for the truth had been validated, at least partially. Each glance at Daniel's body reminded her that she could no longer be the woman she once was. She could not return to the world where she was just a wife, a woman who was supposed to live in harmony with those she loved and trusted. Now her world was shattered, and she stood before a choice from which there was no turning back. She knew this was the only solution, and it left an indelible mark on her life. Lauren sat in silence, listening to the sounds from outside. The police had not yet arrived. Each moment felt heavier, and her thoughts were torn apart by pain and disappointment. She didn't even try to justify herself. She knew that her actions weren't driven by love, but by hatred, by revenge, and this knowledge would stay with her forever. When the police finally arrived, they found Lauren sitting in the same spot next to the bed. She stood when they entered, but her gaze was empty. She didn't try to hide, didn't try to run. She didn't feel fear. She knew her actions were irreversible, and now she had to face the consequences. There was no horror in her eyes, just sadness and the realization that everything had ended. The officers searched the house and conducted initial checks. Lauren remained silent, not attempting to explain, not trying to apologize. She knew her excuses would not be heard. All she could do was confess and try to grasp the horror she had created. When they took her to the station, Lauren felt her body grow heavy. The ride in the police car felt long, each minute filled with reflection. She already knew her life would never be the same. The wait for interrogation was unbearable, but she still felt there was no turning back. Her words, her confession, her actions, all of it was engraved in her mind like a mark on the unknown page of her fate. The silence of the interrogation room was deafening. Lauren sat at the table, facing the investigator. She tried to focus, but her thoughts were tangled, and her heart tightened with anxiety. All she could think about was that everything she had done would now be discussed, judged, and that her life, her normal life, was over. She knew the consequences would be catastrophic. She told everything. The process was mechanical, like describing simple facts, but each word came with pain. Lauren knew that confessing wouldn't change anything, that all her suffering, all her experiences couldn't bring Daniel back. It wouldn't bring him back, and it wouldn't rid her of the pain. In her mind, one question spun. What now? Lauren understood that her decision was the end of everything she had built, the end of her relationship with her husband, the end of her old life. And in this end, there was neither salvation nor redemption. Everything was lost. The next morning, Lauren found herself in court sitting before the judge. Her entire life had shrunk to one terrifying reality. Her actions were considered premeditated murder. The time spent in the defendant's chair felt like an eternity. She felt as if everything that had once mattered to her, family, relationships, love, was dying in her soul. Now, when the verdict was announced, she heard what she feared most: 25 years of imprisonment. That number pressed down on her chest. 25 years. This was the sentence that fell upon her, and she knew there was no going back. Lauren stood silently and left the courtroom. Her steps sounded like an echo in the empty room of her life. All her dreams, all her ambitions, all her hopes had crumbled. She sat in prison, listening to the sounds behind bars, and realized she was the cause of her own downfall. Her revenge, her cruelty, her decision, this had all led to the point where her life would now be part of this place, this time. And despite everything she had been through, Lauren couldn't say that she regretted her actions. She still believed she had acted rightly, but she understood that her path had no return. Time in prison seemed unbearably slow for Lauren. Every morning she woke up in a small cell furnished with only the essentials: an iron cot, a narrow bedside table, a dark corner with a small window. Everything around her was the same gray and unattractive, just like her life, which now seemed completely destroyed. Behind bars there was no room for regret, only strict rules, bitter reflections, and endless hours filled with loneliness. As time went on, Lauren began to feel as if her future was disappearing beyond the horizon. She didn't know how long she would remain in this place, but she knew one thing: she would never leave it the same. Each day was like the one before, and each reminded her of everything she had lost: freedom, love, family. Everything was gone, and now her only companion was the silence, which drowned out even her boldest thoughts. Meanwhile, her case continued in court. The prosecutor presented all the evidence, outlining the horrific details of the crime. The entire situation was broken down into pieces, and each word from the investigation felt like a stone falling onto her consciousness, pressing it tighter. The words of accusation left her with nothing but emptiness. She didn't try to defend herself. Lauren knew her actions were irreversible. She couldn't bring Daniel back. She couldn't get her life back. She couldn't get her happiness back. But at the same time, she still couldn't say that she regretted what she had done. Her lawyer, an experienced attorney, tried to find weaknesses in the prosecution's case, but he understood that her situation was completely hopeless. He knew that the only way to ease her fate was to confess and ask for leniency. He hoped that perhaps the mitigating factor of Lauren acting under severe stress at the time of the crime might reduce the sentence. The trial was long. Lauren sat in the courtroom, listening to every word the prosecutor said and every word her defense lawyer spoke. Every sentence seemed heavier than the last. She was ready for the fact that her life would now consist of endless hearings and court sessions, with nothing in store for her but a long sentence. When the day came for the court to deliver its verdict, Lauren couldn't handle what she felt. The words of the sentence sounded like a sentence on her very life. The court found her guilty of first-degree murder, but as a mitigating circumstance, it took into account her state of mind at the time of the crime. However, Lauren couldn't expect too light a punishment. The court handed down a sentence that marked the final point in this tragic story. 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. These words rang out in the courtroom like a loud blow that echoed in her head. Lauren couldn't believe that her life had been completely destroyed. She realized that now her existence would be tied exclusively to these four walls. There was no room left for the future, for hopes, or for dreams. The only thing left was to survive the years of imprisonment, each day sinking deeper into the emptiness that remained after she took the life of the one she had once loved. When the judge announced the sentence, Lauren felt her body grow heavy. Each word seemed more detached than the last. Her life, which she had once considered normal, was now on the brink. She was no longer just a woman, but a criminal who had lost everything she once had. But the hardest part was the realization that even this ruined existence could not redeem her. After the session ended, Lauren was escorted out of the courtroom by guards. Every movement she made was mechanical, as if she was no longer a person but just part of the system. Her footsteps echoed in her head as a reminder that her path now had no end. She understood that she would never leave this place the same. Even if she ever left prison, she would be someone who could no longer live a normal life. Her career, her family, her happiness, everything was gone. Now, before her, there was only a life in the shadows. Meanwhile, in prison, a new reality awaited her. The space she found herself in was cramped and strict. There was no place for ease, for freedom. The prison walls seemed to swallow all of life, making her a part of this mechanical system. Time passed, but despite the years, Lauren remained in the same state she had been in after killing Daniel. Perhaps she could have survived it all if her thoughts hadn't been consumed by the constant question, what if I had done things differently? But the question remained unanswered. With each passing year in prison, Lauren became more detached. She could have started over, but that would require time. Time she didn't have. Everything she had once known about herself was now destroyed by her own hands. Several years passed since Lauren's sentencing. Time in prison felt like an eternity. She had long since grown accustomed to the grayness and monotony of prison life. Each day was like the one before. Early wake-up, work, several hours in her cell, meetings with a psychologist, reading books, long nights where her thoughts were her only companions. All of this had become part of her new reality, and perhaps it was this routine that allowed her to continue to exist. But with every year spent in prison, Lauren became more and more aware that her time of punishment would pass, and one day, perhaps, new horizons would open for her. She felt her inner strength gradually returning. But as she became stronger, her experiences and pain deepened. The doubts, as always, didn't leave her. Did I make the right choice? Do I have the right to redemption? These questions didn't give her peace, even when she started to adapt to life in prison. One of the few aspects that could awaken any sense of normality in her was the correspondence with her mother. Despite her mistakes, despite what Lauren had done to her own husband, her mother continued to support her, despite everything. In her letters, she spoke about how important it was to find the strength to forgive, and how hard it was to accept the fact that her daughter had become a murderer. But each time, her mother expressed hope that Lauren would someday realize her mistake and be able to start living a true life. At times, Lauren reread these letters, feeling how heavy they weighed on her heart. She knew her mother would never fully forgive her, but in these lines, there was sincerity, an attempt to find light in the darkest situation. She couldn't forget that everything that had been between her and Daniel had been destroyed by her own hands. Every step she took had become part of this tragic story. But one day, when she had already resigned herself to the idea that her life would only be here, behind bars, unexpected news came. Her lawyer informed her that she could apply for parole. According to new laws, her behavior in prison, her participation in rehabilitation programs, and her lack of further offenses allowed her to make such a request. And although Lauren didn't believe she would be released, she decided to try. This was her last chance. Maybe not for freedom, but at least for a new beginning. This decision wasn't easy, but it was important. She understood that her past wouldn't leave her alone, but perhaps a new beginning could give her a chance to be useful, perhaps to do everything the way she had always wanted. The process was long, but the day came when she was brought into the courtroom to decide her fate. Lauren sat on the defendant's bench, clutching the documents prepared for her defense. All these years, she had avoided thinking about her release, believing it was impossible. But now, when the moment had arrived, she realized she was ready to face the consequences of her actions. There was no room left for deception. Lauren was ready to hear the truth, whatever it might be. When the judge, having carefully listened to the arguments of the attorneys and the prosecution, made his decision, Lauren felt her heart tighten. She couldn't imagine that her life could change so much in just a few minutes. The judge announced that she could be released, but with conditions. Lauren had to complete several more years of probation, perform mandatory community service, and undergo a psychological rehabilitation course. But she was not ready for full release that would allow her to return to a normal life. All she could get was a chance to rebuild her fate, starting with the obligation to earn society's trust. When Lauren returned to her cell, her feelings were mixed. She didn't know what to do with the opportunity that had been given to her. She found herself at a crossroads again, to leave everything as it was and continue her life, or try to rebuild everything from the ground up. The release was not just a legal victory for her, but an internal milestone. She understood that this step would mean rejecting the past mistakes that had brought her here. But it was also about forgiveness. Forgiving herself, forgiving everyone she had once betrayed. And even though she was free, Lauren's inner world still remained in the shadows. She knew that the days when she could truly be happy were gone. But before her was a chance to do something right, to do something useful, to try and find redemption. This was her final test, a test she had to pass to prove to herself and others that, even in the darkest corners, light could be found. As she stepped outside, Lauren felt how the world around her had become vast and endless. And even though she was free, she knew that the path to true freedom lay within her own heart. Time would tell whether she could justify this chance and regain her self-respect. But now, she had a chance to live for real.